about local advocacy. So why local advocacy, especially in a program that's meant to be talking about misinformation? We know from studies about scientific communication and practicing scientific communication in the field that it's vital to understand your audience and establish trust if you want your message to get across. And it turns out it's easiest to get that trust when you are a member of the community you are communicating in. So doing advocacy in your own community can be more impactful. This is also a way you can address misinformation in your own backyard. I think many of us have had the experience where you run into someone from your hometown and you automatically feel a rapport with that person because you can both reminisce about a certain location or maybe like a favorite food or some cultural event that you remember fondly. That same feeling is what we hope to cultivate when we address misinformation in our own backyards through local advocacy. So again, why local advocacy? Federal policy tends to dominate our attention. The media, loves to focus on Washington, D.C. and a lot of the policies that my office works on because it can all feel very important. But local policy directly impacts you and often has a more direct impact than a lot of those federal policies. Local policy is things like the schools that your children attend. It's the management of resources in your own neighborhood, construction in your neighborhood, how water is treated in your neighborhood, and so on and so forth. But it's not just a small matter. That local policy is also a piece of the bigger picture. Things that happen at the micro level affect macro level issues. So I have here a picture of my little county, which is Arlington County, Virginia, which I'll use as an example throughout this talk, as a piece of the larger state of Virginia. And so some of these micro policies, the way that Arlington has its housing policy can impact the broader Northern Virginia housing supply, for example, or, things like building a power line require the coordination across multiple counties, cities, districts. If one county or city is restrictive or denies it, then the broader picture means that nobody gets that project. So we want to make sure that our local advocacy helps solve larger scale problems. And here's a few examples of those things that require action at every scale. I know a lot of us are concerned about climate change, and local advocacy doesn't feel like you could necessarily address a problem that spans the entire planet. But we need action at every scale. And climate change is one of the primary examples of how local advocacy is so important. In the 1960s, for example, California passed tailpipe emission standards that forced the hand of the auto industry and therefore caused changing regulations across all of the US. So one state changing its policy had a ripple effect across the entire country. We've also seen this with certain cities. During the Trump administration, when we pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords, many cities reaffirmed their commitment to the Paris Climate Accords, even though the US as a whole was no longer committed. And they are now on track to meet those 2025 carbon reduction goals. So with many of these global scale issues, action in your own community can make a difference. So what does local advocacy look like? And this can mean different things depending on what scale you're looking at, whether that's in your county, your city, your village or town, or however they want to describe it. There's many different words when you get to the smallest scales of government. But there are different venues for advocacy at the local level. These can include things like town halls, which are general meetings where you can get FaceTime with your elected official. These can be regularly scheduled public meetings or public meetings and hearings relating to a specific project or budget. or action. It can look like meetings with individual elected officials, or in a more involved way, serving on advisory boards, or writing op-eds in your local paper for certain issues that are important to you. So now the piece where misinformation comes in. Local public meeting attendees aren't always reflective of the diversity of their communities. Studies have found that attendees of local meetings tend to skew older, more male than female, more longtime residents, and homeowners. And so that's not necessarily representative of all the people that may live in a community, such as students or people working in more temporary jobs, which academia is very familiar with, like postdocs. That doesn't take into account people who may have caretaker duties, who can't attend the 7 p.m. weeknight meetings, or people who have weird shift hours. And so they're not as likely to be present at these meetings, and their voices don't get heard. In 2019, there was a study based on housing policy, and if you've heard of NIMBYs, this is one of the big examples where misinformation tends to spread, and a small group can hamstring a larger area. For a development project, a small group of motivated individuals who are directly impacted by that project are more likely to show up to their local public hearings than the people who would benefit from the more diffuse impacts of having more housing. And we see this play out across the whole US, which is why we have such a terrible housing crisis. So those people that show up, those small motivated groups who oppose development projects, who oppose things like power lines, who oppose bike lanes, they can be intentionally or unintentionally spreading misinformation through their advocacy, through their public comments, through their participation in these local meetings, right? So here I just have a few examples of things that you'll see people protesting about, when there's a affordable housing development being proposed or bike lanes being proposed, and you'll get your chance to discuss some of these things in our exercise. So how can you get started in your own community? This is going to require you to do a little bit of legwork because, like I said, every community is slightly different in how it's set up, who has what power, and where public meetings are held, when. So you'll need to go and look online and find out what applies to you and how best you can go about getting involved. So I recommend starting with what public meetings are held and when, finding out what topics are on the agenda. Are they talking about the budget? Are they talking about a special project, a construction project, or some other policy relating to your community? And then find out what the proper procedures are for submitting comments or speaking at a meeting. Oftentimes, the slots to talk are limited and can fill up very quickly, so you need to be motivated and on the ball. So I pulled up here another example from my own backyard here in Arlington, Virginia. These are just some screenshots from my own local council. And so on the front page, you find links to all the meetings and agendas. And you can see here that there is a meeting on one Saturday and one Tuesday per month. And you can have a public comment on Saturday mornings. So, okay, that's the first thing I need to know. Saturday mornings are when I need to go if I want to make a comment. And then I want to know how to do this. So after digging around a little bit, following some links, I find instructions on how to speak at my county board meeting, right? So you want to check these rules and be sure you know the procedures and proper etiquette if you want to speak. Now, this is more general science policy tips and tricks to be very effective. This is applicable at pretty much every level. And like I said before, you definitely want to understand how your local government is structured. This also applies at the federal level. You want to know who is in charge of what, who's on what committees, who has authority for this or that. If you go and talk to an official who has no power over the budget, for example, or the health services or water and sanitation, you're just not going to get very far on your issue because they literally can't do anything about it. So be sure you know who you're talking to and what power they have. It also behooves you to know the interests of your elected officials. If you find someone who is also interested in your issue, you're more likely to make progress. You can do so by either scanning their social media or signing up for their newsletters. You can attend other meetings and see the kinds of things they talk about or bring up. Look at their voting record. What have they supported or been against? And get a general profile before you approach an elected official. And most importantly, you want to start building relationships with your elected officials. You are more likely to be successful when you have a relationship, when that person knows that they can trust you to be reasonable and useful to them. They, in turn, will be reasonable and useful to you. Now, general advocacy tips. Whenever you're doing anything, speaking or writing for policy purposes, I want to emphasize that you need to do your research, which I hope has been a theme, and whether that involves, looking at different myths and misinformation and addressing those points, do so here in your research. Find out where your elected official lies on these issues, find out what kind of political arguments might be for and against, and so on and so forth. Then you always want to lead with your ask. So this is your specific policy ask, the thing that you want your elected official to do. In policy, you are often talking to someone who is very busy and has many different issues they are working on. They are time limited, and if you only have a minute to talk to them, you want to be sure that they understand what you want from them. After that, you can expand into your supporting data, your supporting narratives. You always want to be respectful and succinct in your arguments. All right, these people, whether or not they agree with you, are going to be respectful to you, so you should be respectful to them. Also, avoid jargon. I know that can be hard for us as scientists, and so do be sure that your point gets across clearly for someone who may not be an expert in your area, but is still an intelligent person. And then finally, be sure you use narratives in addition to facts. Our elected officials care about people first and foremost. That is their job. They were elected by people to care for people. So talk about how the issue impacts you or your students or your family, your community, so on and so forth. All right, facts alone will just run right back out of the head. Statistics, they don't stay for long, but stories stick with us for a long time. And if possible, finish again with your ask and follow up. Thank them for their time. Now we are going to move into our exercise where all of you will get to participate. We're going to be talking about different example public comments. And so before we start, I just wanted to give a few pointers on what a good public comment would include. And at the end of this session today, you will get a resource document that has a bunch of this information, both for public comments and for a lot of the policy topics I have talked about already. So when you make a public comment at a local meeting or a town hall, you want to be sure to give a brief introduction of yourself and your expertise. Justify why should your elected officials and your community listen to you about this specifically. You want to let them know how this issue impacts you or your community. Have your ask up front, again, just like the tips from before, and then provide your supporting details, data, and examples. And most of the time, your public comment will be very limited in terms of the time you're granted. So keep it short and sweet. Now, I will turn it over to Allie to get us started on our exercise.